Today, we're going to be speaking with Bill Keller, who was the founding editor in chief of the Marshall Project and also author of the book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Bill, I really appreciate you being on today.
Thanks for having me.
So, I guess to start with, at least in some theoretical sense, prison sentences in the United States are supposed to be for rehabilitation, right? The idea that someone has done something wrong, harmful to society and or to victims. They have been sentenced to some amount of time in prison, and that experience, the time that they spend in prison, is at least to some degree rehabilitative in addition to being punitive, so that then they serve their sentence, they come out, and now they're rehabilitated, right? At least sort of theoretically. Can you talk about whether in practice any elements of the criminal justice system in the US actually function in that way?
Not really. I mean, you can find individual programs that function that way, some of them experimental, some of them more broadly based, like college education programs that actually do rehabilitate. But there are a number of obstacles. One of them is cost. It's expensive to do rehabilitation programs. You need trained personnel and so on. One of them is a kind of puritanical streak, I think, in American culture. The punishment is the main objective from that point of view, and rehabilitation is just pampering. Also, prisons are not the most ideal therapeutic environment. They're scary, they're noisy, the people who police them are really cops, not therapists or social workers. They don't have the training to administer those sorts of programs. So there are a lot of obstacles. The heroes of my book, if I can call them that, are the corrections officials who are trying to improve rehabilitation in spite of the obstacles, and the teachers, the volunteers, prisons are kind of a mystery. It's why I chose to write about prisons rather than courts or cops, because there's been a lot of attention deservedly paid to policing. Judges and prosecutors, for the most part, run for public office and do a lot of their business in public. Prisons are kind of a mystery. So that's why I wanted to focus on them.
If we put aside for a second when there are actual rehabilitation programs, the sort of status quo day to day of being in your standard prison, at this point, we know beyond any doubt that's not a rehabilitative experience in any way, is it? And in fact, it could sort of be the opposite.
No, that's absolutely right. There's considerable research by people like Bruce Western at Columbia who show that the being incarcerated can actually make you more likely to commit crimes when you get out.
Right. And when we say that, there's this sort of general idea prison can turn you into a more hardened or violent criminal, and it's often repeated. But what sort of data do we have about that?
Well, the one piece of data that's kind of shocking is that 2/3 of the people who are incarcerated will be rearrested within 5 years of their release. The recidivism rate, it's a tricky metric, and then people measure it different ways, but the recidivism suggests that we are not doing a very effective job of rehabilitating overall.
When we talk about the deterrent effect of the system that we have, and the idea that at the end of some crime that one commits, if you are caught and charged and convicted, there could be a punishment that's coming. From what I've read, studies have found that the death penalty, as compared to life in prison without parole, does not seem to be a functional deterrent in terms of reducing the crimes wherein one would be eligible for such punishments. What do we know more generally about prison sentences and the deterrent effect on those not in prison?
There's a sociologist named Francis Cullen at University of Cincinnati who's done a lot of work on this subject, and he he makes this logical argument that the deterrent effect assumes that before you commit a crime, you stop and consider the risks in a sort of logical way. Whereas the great majority of crimes are either opportunistic, they're done in concert with, going along with a gang, they're spontaneous. And to the extent that people do stop and consider the consequences before they do something illegal, they're mainly considering the chances of getting caught.
Right.
It doesn't make a difference to them whether the punishment is 5 years for a felony or 20 years for a felony. That's just not the way people think.
Yeah, we were talking about jaywalking yesterday on our program because the California governor Newsom recently signed into law a bill that mostly decriminalizes jaywalking. And I think that there's sort of some gray area in the sense that, like, I jaywalk all the time. And it is true that if I knew that life in prison was a possible sentence for jaywalking, I wouldn't do it. But you need these really extreme examples that in order to really be able to make that case. Whereas, as you talk about with many crimes, murder in particular, murders are such a type of crime where already you're talking about only a fraction of the population is even willing to commit a murder based on the research we have. That the line between life in prison with no parole and death penalty, for example, it seems like it's a completely different type of consideration than my jaywalking example.
Right. I mean, I would never say that the risk of going to jail or being severely punished doesn't figure into anybody's thinking at all. I mean, the deterrence exists, but it's just greatly exaggerated, and you weigh that against the effects of being incarcerated on your likelihood to commit another crime. It's not a convincing reason to lock people up, especially to lock people up as we do for far longer periods of time and for lesser crimes than most other countries.
Yeah, I want to talk about that next. So can you give some specific examples of average sentence in the US for certain crimes compared to in some other countries for which we have data for the same crime?
Sure. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
Yeah, any crime that that we could think of a difference in average sentencing between the U.S. and other countries.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. Mass incarceration is a relatively new phenomenon for us. I think that's important to remember that for most of the 20th century, the, the incarceration rate in the United States was something like 100 people incarcerated for every 100,000 population, which was a little higher than the rest of the world, but not off the tracks. And then beginning in the 70s, we took a sharp right turn, and it became more like 500 people in jail for every 100,000 in the population. I mean, that's an incredible phenomenon. And part of that is that we incarcerate people for much longer periods of time. I'm talking here about developed countries, mostly the European countries, the ones that I've taken a look at. Most countries don't have a death penalty. They don't have life without parole. In the book, I talk about the case of Anders Breivik, who's a Norwegian mass murderer who slaughtered 70-some kids at a party, political party picnic. And his sentence was 21 years. Now, if he's deemed to be a danger to society, a judge can extend that. But that's, by Norwegian standards, that's the maximum punishment.
Right. Yeah. Are there, sometimes there's this idea that if you do the European style of incarceration, where conditions generally speaking are better and sentences are shorter, that there's a higher recidivism rate, but it doesn't appear to be borne out in the data, is it?
No, the recidivism rates in all of the Scandinavian countries and Germany and most of the developed world are considerably lower than ours.
So to me, what that says is that for some of the folks in the United States who are demanding the stricter prison sentences, I don't really think they care, Bill, about the rehabilitative effect or the odds of recidivism. I think there's a sort of you did the thing and now you deserve a strict punishment. There's kind of this strict father morality aspect to it that's totally untethered from the actual impact. What's your sense?
That's absolutely right. There are a couple of reasons why we should care, even if a lot of people have a hard sell on this. There's a, I guess, moral reason that Americans like to profess that we believe in second chances and redemption. And so if we want to live up to those ideals, we should be treating prison inmates as if they were redeemable. But beyond that, there's a pragmatic, down-to-earth, self-centered argument for rehabilitation. Every year, we let out 600,000 people from state and federal prisons. Would you rather have those people emerge from prison brutalized, alienated, stigmatized, and lacking in any kind of skills that will help them re-enter the real world? Or would you like to have them equipped with be citizens and neighbors? That to me is a pretty convincing argument.
Yeah, it seems the preferable answer is clear on that. To talk a little bit about the kind of society that is created within many prisons. I interviewed the author Ted Conover, who wrote this book New Jack, in which he actually
Great book.
became a great book. He became a corrections officer at Sing Sing in New York and talks about his experiences. And he did it knowing his plan was ultimately to write a book. And he talks quite a bit about the reality of the sort of culture around being a corrections officer in the United States and the pressures faced, systemic and otherwise. And he doesn't excuse any of the behavior that he observed when he was in the job, but he sort of gives a glimpse into the realities of how the corrections officer circumstances impact how prisons are run as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is unique in the United States about being a corrections officer and the expectations and the pressures?
If you want to be a corrections officer in Germany, you have to take 2 years of college level courses, including things like human rights law, psychology, sociology, and then your job is essentially to be a therapist, is putting it a little too strongly, but to engage the inmates to try to figure out what it was that made them go wrong and see what programs would be available to address it. If you're going to become a corrections officer in the United States, and I'm generalizing broadly here, there's a saying in corrections that if you've seen one prison, you've seen one prison. Everyone has its own kind of culture.
Yeah.
But for the most part, if you're going to become a corrections officer, as Ted Conover's book demonstrated, you're going to get a few weeks of training, mostly about crowd control and self-defense. It's more of a paramilitary organization. I have, as Ted emerged from that experience, with a fair amount of empathy for the prison guards, that they're in a sense victims of the environment and the culture too. And I think there's some truth in that.
Yeah. And
They're
it
all,
seems
they're
to
also
some
organized.
degree, oh, sorry, Bill, I was going to say, there seems to be a mirroring in one of the things that it seems many police departments would benefit from, mirrors something that corrections officers would benefit from as well, which is more training along the lines of sort of social work and relationship building and community building.
Yeah, and you can find leaders of organized corrections officers unions and things who will say that. That's in the last 10 years or so, they've begun to talk the talk a little bit. Unfortunately, they're organized in the states that have really strong corrections officers unions. They tend to be a source of resistance because they don't want to mess with the job.
One of the things that is more unique in the United States is this concept of a for-profit prison run by a corporation that contracts with various agencies. And sometimes those contracts include guaranteed occupancy, where even if there is not actually a certain occupancy, the prison operator gets paid as if they were. So they have a certain expectation of guaranteed revenue that they are going to be receiving. Can you talk a little bit about, even though most inmates in the United States are not held at for-profit private prisons, what is particular or unique to the for-profit prison experience in the United States? Or is it the same as in the state-run and federal prisons?
There's another book by a journalist who went undercover as a prison guard, Shane Bauer's book. Um, and he went underground in a Louisiana prison that was a private owned by Corrections Corporation of America.
Mm.
And he does a nice job, first of all, of demonstrating that the bottom line becomes a big factor in the thinking of those prisons, but also that the whole history of incarceration in America, it has various profit motives associated with them, starting most egregiously with the South, where prison labor became a substitute for slave labor
Mm.
without much improvement in the conditions and certainly without any pay.
So it seems as though it's essentially quite similar, but with the profit motive added on top of it. I mean, is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's I think that's fair to say. It's actually, you're right in saying that it's a small percentage of the incarcerated population who are in privately run prisons, but that misses the auxiliary services that even the state-run prisons contract for. People to make phone services available, to do medical care, to do transport, to run the cafeterias. Often those are contracted out to private companies that don't have any incentive to do more than they have to.
So there's elements of privatization even within state and federally run prisons as well. I did not know that.
Correct. One example that's been a big issue lately in a lot of prisons is there's a company that makes available tablets so that you can download books for your class and communicate with. As a general rule, prisoners don't have access to the internet, but they can get limited services on a tablet. But the company charges exorbitant rates for the use of them, and prison inmates rarely have any opportunity to earn the money to pay for them.
Yep, and that's we've seen that also with exorbitant phone rates in prisons as well. Bill, we've been speaking with
Yes.
Bill Keller, who is the author of "What's Prison For: Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration." Bill, very interesting, and I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to spread the message.